This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end, no safety or surprise. The end, I'll never look into your eyes again. Can you picture what will be so limitless and free, desperately in need of some stranger's hand in a desperate land?
Acts 27. Going to read the first two. Let's start with the first two verses. It says, when it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. When we had boarded a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So Paul's appeal to Rome, his appeal to Caesar had been granted, and so along with him are two companions, Aristarchus, who is mentioned here, and the other one is, of course, Luke, who is writing all of this. They get put onto a boat with a bunch of other prisoners and put under the charge of a guy named Julius, who Julius had double duty. So this was very common in Roman culture, that this is how they would do transports of goods from around the Roman Empire back to Rome. They would put a centurion in charge of that, and that would be their responsibility to make sure that whatever goods it was, in this case it would be like grains coming from Egypt, and so his responsibility was to oversee the transportation of those goods from Egypt to Rome. And then along with that, the other half of his duty was to oversee the prisoners who would be coming to Rome for, could be a couple different things, but in most cases, probably 90% of the time, these prisoners that were put on these ships, they were going to Rome to become spectators or to become spectacles in the games. So they were on their way to their certain death. They were going to be put into the arena and eaten by wild animals, slaughtered by other gladiators. It was just, they were off to their death sentence. And this is where Paul and his companions get put. They get put on this ship. And here is the plan. Luke gives us the plan off the bat here. He says our goal is to set sail and to make port cities along the coast of Asia along the way. So here's your map. I might have to do this. So here is kind of what the course looked like. They were down here at the bottom right on this map. That's where they began, in Caesarea. They left from there. They were going to sail along the coast, around all of these places, all the way up to the top left to get to Rome. And so that was the plan. And these ships, and the reason that they would sail that way, I mean, if you look at that map, it looks like it'd be a whole lot easier just to make one big swoop and go all the way up to Rome, right? But these ships, remember, this is not today. This was before powered motors. This was before GPS. They didn't have all those things. So the way these ships worked, they were probably 100 to 150 feet long, big wooden ships that were powered by two giant oars that stuck out the back of the boat, mostly to control the direction of the boat, and then sails. So they were at the behest of the wind. And so if the wind wasn't working for them, they didn't have much of a chance. So they would stay near the coast, and they didn't have GPS, so they needed to keep line of sight on the coast so they would know where they were going, right? So this is what they would do. They would sail in open waters, but they would get out and go with the direction of the wind, but they would keep the coast within eye shot on the horizon so that they would know where they were at all times, and they would never get lost at sea that way. So that is the plan. But let's keep reading and let's see what happens, because we know what happens to plans, right? The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. When we had put out to sea from there, we sailed along the northern coast of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And after sailing through the open sea off Sicilia and Pamphylia, we reached Myra in Lycia. Lots of interesting Greek names in all of this, isn't there? There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy and put us on board. Sailing slowly for many days with difficulty, we arrived off, it looks like Cnidus, but it's actually pronounced Cnidus. All right? So we arrived off of Cnidus. Since the wind did not allow us to approach it, we sailed along the south side of Crete off Salmone, and with still more difficulty, we sailed along the coast and came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lycia. All right, so right off the bat, things aren't that bad for Paul, right? So they leave Caesarea. They spend one night at sea, and then the next day they arrive in Sidon. They port to pick up supplies and do all those kinds of things. And the centurion guard, Julius, actually he's really nice to Paul, and it kindly might be a bit of a stretch. It just means that he was treated humanely. He wasn't like a lot of the prisoners that was just treated as garbage. He was treated humanely, and he was actually allowed to disembark and go to some of his friends to receive care. So who were these friends? Because as far as we know, Paul never went to Sidon. He didn't plant any churches there. Who were these friends that he went to see in Sidon? And this is really, really interesting. If we way back to Acts chapter 11. All right, in Acts 11, Luke wrote that now those who had been scattered as a result of the persecution that started because of Stephen made their way as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. Sidon is the capital city of the territory Phoenicia. So when Paul, who approvingly participated in the martyrdom of Stephen and the persecution of the church that happened after that, and all of these believers scattered throughout the region and began planting churches in these different regions, this Sidon was one of those places where the persecuted church had expanded and planted churches, and this was roughly 30 years prior to this moment. And now here we see Paul, about 30 years later, in chains for that very same gospel that he was so happy to persecute, now receiving care and treatment from a church that was planted as a result of what he had participated in 3 decades earlier. Pretty cool, isn't it? And so Paul then goes to them, and they probably gave him some food and supplies for the journey, sent him back to the boat, and they continue on their course. Now, I'm going to zoom in on this map and show you a little bit more of where they went in all of this. So we started down here in Caesarea. First night they made it to Sidon. And then from there they sailed up and around Cyprus because they had to follow the wind. So they're following the south winds that took them up. They followed the coast. They went around. They made port at Myra. And that's kind of where we stopped in our reading here. But look at what Luke says here in verse 4. The winds were against us. In verse 7, that we were sailing slowly and we were sailing with difficulty. The winds didn't allow us. And then in verse 8, with still more difficulty. 5 times in these 4 verses, Luke mentions how difficult this trip was. And they're just a couple of days into it, right? Like right off the bat, after they left Sidon, things went haywire for them. But they eventually make it to a place called the Fair Havens. Now that sounds nice, doesn't it? Like that sounds like that would be a place with a spa and some tennis courts. You know, you're in those, you see all the old rich white guys in their really short shorts out there playing tennis. And like that's Fair Havens. That's what you think of, right? With a name like Fair Havens. But that's not quite it. So let's read and see what happens here at Fair Havens. By now, much time had passed, and the voyage, verse 9, was already dangerous. I'm picking up here that Luke is not a fan of this trip, right? Since the Day of Atonement was already over, Paul gave his advice and told them, "Men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives." But the centurion paid attention to the captain and the owner of the ship rather than to what Paul said. Since the harbor was unsuitable to winter in, the majority decided to set sail from there, hoping somehow to reach Phoenix, a harbor on Crete facing southwest and northwest, and to winter there. And when a gentle south wind sprang up, they thought they had achieved their purpose. They weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. So Luke keeps ranting about how terrible of a trip this is. And then he mentions that the Day of Atonement had passed. Now, there's not any theological significance of that in this story, in Luke's telling of that. The reason he mentions it is because he's giving some very important historical information. The Day of Atonement, obviously it was based on the Jewish calendar, but we can trace that back, and we know that that was, in this year that this took place, that was on October 5th, okay? They had set sail around then. They would set sail on October 5th, and they've been traveling for a couple of weeks now. So they're several weeks in. They're maybe right about the time that we are right now, end of October, beginning of November, somewhere in there. And there was a nautical rule in the Mediterranean Sea that there were certain times that you just did not sail. With the kind of ships that they had, you would, like, between mid-October and early November, that was like the cautious time. So you beachgoers, this was a yellow flag situation, right? Like, yeah, you can go in the water, but you need to really be careful because it could get ugly in a hurry, right? After early November, so by like November 10th or so, it was a double red flag situation. You do not sail. And they're butting up against this. They're towing the line of this, it's cautious to sail, or absolutely don't sail in this weather. And that's what they're trying to decide what they do. And we read here, Paul is like, "Hey guys, I don't think we should do this. This is certain disaster. You're going to lose your ship, all of your cargo, all the supplies that you're supposed to be taking to Rome. It's all going to go to the bottom of the sea, and so are we, by the way. So let's not do this, right?" And here is a map of where they wanted to go. So they had done all of this sailing. We get around here to Fair Havens, and then they wanted to set sail to Phoenix, which wasn't very far. It was just a 40-mile trip further down the coast, right? So it's not very far. How many of you have, let's just imagine for a second, you're driving down the highway, and your low gas light comes on, and you've been driving that way for a little while. You're already pushing it somewhat, and you see an exit ahead, and there is one gas station, no other signs of life at all, nothing else around. And as you get closer, like, this gas station looks pretty janky. Like, it's very dirty. In your car, you can smell, like, you can imagine what that place smells like. I don't want to go to that gas station, but I'm about to run out of gas. The next exit's 40 miles down the road, but it's a city with lots of gas stations, clean bathrooms, a Chick-fil-A, maybe a Buc-ee's. How many of you are going to risk it and you're going to the next town? Show of hands. Yes, like, how many of you are taking your chances with the crappy gas station? Interesting, okay. So I, for one, am risking it. That gas light is a suggestion anyway, so I'm risking it. We're going to Buc-ee's, and that's just how it's going to be, right? And that was the debate that they were having. They're in Fair Haven, but Fair Haven, the reason that they didn't want to stay there was because Fair Haven was a podunk town. There was not really a town there. There was nothing there for them to do. It was just a place to put your boat, basically. And even at that, it wasn't very good. It was not a good place for the winter. So in the winter, when that wind would come in, this was not a protected harbor. So it wasn't a place you would winter your boat there. It would just get tossed to pieces by the waves. Your boat would almost certainly take on damage. You didn't want to spend the winter months in this Fairhaven, despite its name. You would not want to spend the winter there. And so these guys are like, hey, you know what? There's a greater place just up the road. This place doesn't even have a Dairy Queen. Let's get out of here. And Paul's like, no. Paul's with the second half of you who raised your hands. Like, it's not worth the risk, guys. Like, I've been to Buc-ee's. It's just an overrated gas station. We're not going there. We need to stay right here. Trust me on this. We need to stay here. But they chose to follow Julius, right? And who could blame them? So if you're, put yourself in Julius's shoes, right? Julius is kind of calling the shots here because he's overseeing the shipment of cargo. And he has the captain of the boat, this professional sailor who is steering and commandeering the ship. And then he has the owner of the ship who's a business owner working in the shipping industry. And you didn't get to do that in this time by being stupid. You were very successful, wealthy. You knew what you were doing if you owned Roman ships, right? So you got these two guys saying we should keep going. And then you got this old pastor who is under arrest because he's got some crazy ideas giving his 2 cents. Which one are you guys going with? Like, we're probably all taking the opinion of the guys who know what they're talking about, right? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go, the guys that are sailors, I'm trusting them, right? So that is what they end up doing. Paul didn't want to risk it, but it wasn't like Paul was just being ignorant here or that he just had no basis for his thoughts on this. If there have been a lot of studies done on across Paul's missionary trips that we've looked at throughout this book, and Bible scholars suggest that Paul has logged well over 3,000 miles of travel along the Mediterranean Sea between all of his voyages. If we look at, he wrote in 2 Corinthians to the Corinthians, the second letter that he sent, which was he wrote probably 3 or 4 years before this event took place. He's telling about all of the hardships that he has faced for the gospel. And among them, he says, I have been shipwrecked 3 times. Not sure that that's a compelling argument in this case. Like, anybody, if I get onto a plane and the guy next to me is like, hey, you want to know something? I've survived 3 plane crashes. I'm getting off the plane, right? I'm not hitching my wagon to this guy. I don't want anything to do with it. That's not a real compelling argument. But Paul has experienced this before. He understands a little something about sailing in the Mediterranean Sea, and he knows that this is a very dangerous time to sail, and he has big plans. He needs to get to Rome, so let's not be stupid with this. But he is outvoted, and they move on anyway. So in this map, this was where they were supposed to go, from Fairhavens to Phoenix. Simple 40-mile jaunt, right? This is what actually happened. Did not go the way they thought it would, right? Look at verse 14. But before long, a fierce wind called the northeaster rushed down from the island. And since the ship was caught and unable to head into the wind, we gave way to it and we were driven along. And after running under the shelter of a little island called Cauda, we were barely able to get control of the skiff. And after hoisting it up, they used ropes and tackle and girded the ship, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis. They lowered the drift anchor, and in this way they were driven along. Because they were being severely battered by the storm, they began to jettison the cargo the next day. And on the 3rd day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And for many days, neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. So they got caught in this storm. They were just trying to go a simple 40 miles up the road or down the coast, and they get caught in this storm that has a name. It's such a severe storm, it has a name. What kind of storms are so bad and so intense that we give them names? Hurricanes, right? So that's what you need to be thinking about. It's that level of storm that they're facing. This is like Lieutenant Dan and Forrest Gump out in the boat kind of a situation, right? Like, this is very, very severe, and there's little likelihood that they survive this situation. They had lifted the anchor because they had a great south wind, so they didn't have anything to slow them down. They dropped the sails. They are cruising along full speed, and then this northeaster wind comes in and hits them. And it takes them, so if you can go back to that map for a second, Jesse. They're leaving Fair Havens and trying to head straight west, right? This wind is coming out of the northeast, and it is pushing them south. It's moving them down this way, away from where they want to go. Now, one of the real dangers, it says in here that they were afraid. Which verse is that? They were, verse 17, that they were afraid, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis. What is the Syrtis? So the Syrtis was this huge sandbar at the far south end of the Mediterranean Sea off the north coast of Africa, where it was really shallow land and it was just a bunch of sand. And so these boats would come up and they would get stuck in the sand. Some of your translations, if you have a King James or New King James or New Revised, I think it actually uses the word quicksand instead of Syrtis. And that's effectively what it was. These ships would run into this sand, they would get stuck, but they're still too deep for them to get out and wade through, too far from any source of land to actually get to, and their boat would get stuck, and then the waves would just batter it to pieces until the whole thing would collapse and everybody would drown, right? So it really was it was like the Bermuda Triangle of the day. And you can see that ridge down here at the bottom. So this is Africa down here, and you can kind of see this ridge right here. That's where that is. And they were afraid they were going to run into that. But they're way up here, which tells you a little something about their orientation right now, right? They're afraid they're going to hit here, and they're still way up here. They have no idea where they are. And even if they do have an idea, when that wind hits them, they estimated it would take 2 to 3 days of that wind to move them from here to here. So they are in panic mode, full-blown panic mode, that we are in real trouble. We can't see the coastline. We have to take every precaution that we can. So the skiff was the lifeboat, basically, that's on the side. They hoisted that up to keep that safe. They wrapped the entire boat in all of their ropes, basically turning it into a bumper boat to keep it safe in case they crashed into some rocks and keep the hull from breaking. They began throwing things overboard to lighten the weight of the boat to help prevent them from sinking if they should take on water. They were doing everything that they could to keep their boat afloat and to save their lives. And so this is the situation that Paul finds himself in here. And then the next question that we need to ask as we're thinking about this, we just read 20 verses about this, that ultimately doesn't seem to have a whole lot of theological significance in the grand scheme of the book of Acts. Right? This is just kind of a long story from Luke about this voyage at sea and the problems that they were facing. So why does Luke give so much attention, so much time in his letter to the details of this trip? And as I began thinking about that question, I came up with 4 possible answers to it, and there may be more, but there's at least 4, and they all kind of interact together. But the first one is simply historical accuracy, right? Luke loved being historically accurate. That's why he wrote the Gospel of Luke to Theophilus, and then the book of Acts also to Theophilus, kind of as a sequel. And so he knows that all of the people that Paul has met with and planted churches with, they're eventually going to read this account of what happened, and he wants to provide them with accurate details about what happened to Paul, right? Because it wasn't like they could just pull up Facebook and see, hey, I wonder what happened to that guy. And you couldn't do that. So Luke was providing these church planners details about what happened to Paul over the years. A second reason is that this is a very popular storytelling method of this time. This happened consistently. A lot of the ancient Greek stories revolved around traveling at sea, journeys out at sea, shipwrecks, those kinds of things. You think of like Homer's Odyssey involved a lot of sailing and through storms and shipwrecks, and Seneca had some, and Gilligan's Island, that's right. That's all this was. This was simply a 3-hour tour. That's what it was supposed to be, but that is not how it turns out. But yeah, so Homer, Seneca, Petronius, the Roman poet, not the Harry Potter spell. All of these guys, they wrote all of these books about stories about traveling at sea, and this was a very popular thing. So perhaps Luke is kind of including this here as a way of utilizing the culturally popular medium to communicate his gospel message. It's a good reminder to us that we ought to do the same, that we ought to communicate the gospel in ways that are relevant and appeal to the culture around us while we maintain our faithfulness to that gospel message, which is exactly what Luke does. And then thirdly, I think Luke is conveying the importance of the journey itself. When you look at the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, the two books that we know Luke wrote in the New Testament, the styles are very, very similar. But one of the things that stands out about these two books is that how much time Luke devotes to the journey itself. When you look at the Gospel of Luke, basically the entire middle part of that gospel is about Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. In chapter 9, Luke says that at this time, Jesus had determined in his heart to go to Jerusalem. And so everything that happens after that, every teaching that he does, every miracle he performs, every encounter that Luke records, it's all stops along the way to Jerusalem until we get to Luke 19, when Jesus enters Jerusalem in the triumphant entry on the donkey with the palm trees and singing Hosanna and all of that, right? So from chapter 9 to 19 of the Gospel of Luke is about Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. When you look at the book of Acts, from about Acts 19 through 28, it's all about Paul's journey, every event that happens that leads up to Paul's journey from Jerusalem to Rome. So in Act 1, which is the Gospel of Luke, Luke is talking about the importance of the goal of Jesus' ministry of moving taking the gospel to Jerusalem. In Act 2, which is the book of Acts, it is taking that gospel message from Jerusalem to Rome. The two most important cities in the known world then, the Jewish center of Jerusalem and the center of the rest of the world, the Gentile world, Rome. Luke is capturing in two different stories the journey of the gospel getting to those locations. Luke is brilliant in the way he is writing all of this. And so I think it's important that he wants to include these details to show us that the journey itself matters as well. And then the fourth one is it's simply a reminder of God's faithfulness in seemingly hopeless situations. And we'll talk more about this one next week, but Paul mostly held fast to this promise that he had received. But there is something that happens here between verses 19 and verse 20. In verse 19 of Acts 27, these sailors become desperate and they begin throwing everything non-essential overboard. And Luke says they throw this stuff overboard with their own hands. Weird phrase, right? As opposed to using someone else's hands to throw this stuff overboard. Why would Luke say that with their own hands they began throwing this overboard? Luke's point, I think, is to differentiate himself. They began throwing stuff overboard. They were panicking. Everybody on this ship was they were completely distressed. They were completely desperate. They began throwing everything over. And I kind of picture Luke and Paul and Aristarchus sitting there watching all of this happen, trusting in God, believing that, hey, God said we're going to Rome. We're going to Rome. This isn't where we die. This is not the end of the story, right? Like that's what I envision happening here. And he's hanging on to, Paul is hanging on to the words that Jesus spoke to him 2 years earlier, right after he got arrested in Acts 23, 10 and 11. Verse 11, he says that the following night, the Lord stood by Paul and said, "Have courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for you to testify in Rome." Now let's take a quick overview of Paul's situation right here, right? Jesus told him, "You will go to Rome." Paul's plan was to visit Rome on his way to take the gospel to the farthest western ends of the known world, to Spain, right? So he wasn't planning on doing this in chains. He was planned on being free to do this. And I think still at this point, he thought once he got to Rome and he stood his trial, he would be found innocent and he would be free and he would plant churches in Rome and then he would move on and keep going, right? But as it is, he gets arrested in Jerusalem. He spends 2 years in a prison in Caesarea. He gets crammed onto a boat with a couple hundred criminals who are off to their death. His opinion is dismissed. The centurion didn't listen to him. And because he didn't listen to him, now they have spent a couple of weeks out in the middle of the ocean being tossed around. Everybody is panicked. There's complete despair among everybody on this boat. They've done everything they can possibly do to ensure their survival. They have no further recourse to take things into their own hands anymore. And things are kind of looking bad, right? But then, even with that promise of God's faithfulness that Paul is hanging on to, something changes when we get to verse 20. In verse 20, Luke says, after he said many days the sun didn't shine, finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. In verse 19, it was they were panicking, they were doing this, they were throwing stuff over. But in verse 20, we were losing hope that we would be saved. And I think that's interesting to kind of try and wrap our heads around, because I think we too quickly pass over the severity of this, because from our perspective, it's real easy for us to just flip the page and go, oh, hey, look, there's a chapter 28, and it ends with Paul stayed 2 whole years in his own rented house, and he welcomed everyone who visited, proclaiming the kingdom of God, teaching about the Lord Jesus with all boldness and without hindrance. The story ends well for Paul. We're good. Let's keep reading. But in the middle of this situation, they didn't know about Acts 28. They didn't know there was another chapter. They're simply living in this moment where they are out in the middle of the ocean in this boat that with the relentless waves taking them up and down nonstop for weeks, without end, without hope, without sign. They've already thrown everything overboard. They're in serious, serious trouble. And those kind of situations can cast a long shadow over our trust in the faithfulness of God. And so if I can use this situation as a metaphor for a moment, I know that each one of us have seasons like this in our life where there is no light, there's no stars or sun, there's nothing that's really guiding our way and orienting us to the direction that we're going. We're feeling completely lost, we're feeling hopeless, we're afraid for our lives. And sometimes those situations are so powerful that they overshadow our trust in the faithfulness of God. And as we read the rest of the chapter, we see that Paul, who maybe he was included in that maybe Luke is just talking about himself. Like, yeah, we lost. Maybe Paul didn't. Maybe Paul did doubt a little bit here. But as we'll see next week, Paul very quickly gets it back. And he turns on his preacher voice, and that's going to be a really fun one that we look at next week. But sometimes it is powerful for us to simply allow the reality of our dark circumstances to be front and center of our minds, and to not too quickly just skip ahead and try to move on to brighter days, because it's in those dark moments where our faith is really solidified, and where the recognition that we need something bigger than ourselves, we need someone bigger than ourselves and bigger than our situation to step in and rescue it, because as things stand, we're completely hopeless. So I want us to rest in that tonight, that, yeah, your situation, it probably is hopeless. You are probably in, if it's not now, it has been or it will be. You will be in a situation that feels utterly and completely hopeless. And it's in those moments where the faithfulness of God shows up the most. Because as Luke likes to remind us, that there is so much to see in the journey itself. And the Christian life is a difficult journey. If you are following Christ, you have signed up for a very difficult journey. You will experience sometimes very prolonged seasons of hopelessness. Which reminds me of a great quote that I'm going to leave us with tonight from F.B. Meyer, who was a British pastor. He was a contemporary and good friend of D.L. Moody, and he was a major influence. He's not a name you probably recognize, but he was a major influence on Charles Spurgeon, who most of us have heard of, right? But Meyer said that if I am told that I am to take a journey that is a dangerous trip, every jolt along the way will remind me that I'm on the right road. So I want that to be our takeaway tonight, that if you are following a path of maturing discipleship and being a mature disciple of Jesus, the road is going to be bumpy. But let those bumps serve as a reminder that you're at least on the right path and that you are moving in the right direction. Paul and his companions have been losing hope that they would survive this, but at least, they were moving in the right direction, as we'll see next week. They don't end up on the coast of Africa ready to die. They actually closer to than they had intended. And so if Paul, if he ever did doubt at all, he rebounded in what we're going to look at in the very next verse next week. We'll read the rest of chapter 27 for next week, and we'll continue to see how the shipwreck piece ends. God, we love you, and we're grateful that your word teaches us, and as hard as it is to say sometimes, we are grateful for the moments of darkness and hopelessness, because it's in them that we find you. It's in them that we recognize our need for you, and it's coming out of them that we see your hand at work. So I pray that we would look for what you're doing in our lives, that we would see it, that we would be observant to what is taking place around us, how you are working and what you are doing, and the opportunities that we have to grow in the middle of that. And so even though it's hard sometimes, even though it's hard a lot of times, we thank you for the journey. We're grateful that you are using us in our everyday lives to glorify the name of Jesus. So we pray we would take that with all seriousness, and that we would do that well. In Jesus' name, amen.